Thank you for joining us bright and early to start our first full day of the 2017 Conservative Progressive Summit right here at Grand Valley State University. It's great to be with you. Don't forget that you can tweet about this year's summit at hashtag ConProg2017. My name is Scott St. Louis. I'm a proud Grand Valley State University alumnus, class of 2016, and currently I serve as program manager of the Common Ground Initiative for the Hauenstein Center. I've been asked to open up the day's events with some brief remarks about the Common Ground Initiative in general, which one scholar described to us as an important project for a needful time. That's a description which really resonated with us, so I'll begin by saying this. When people hear the phrase common ground at a divisive moment, what occasionally comes to mind at first are misty-eyed visions of false unity, a pipe dream draped in a flag, satisfying only to the mawkish and the naive. But at the Hauenstein Center, our approach to common ground is not about diving reflexively into a bland, tenuous middle. It does not entail merely splitting the difference among various constellations of thought. Rather, we believe that pursuing common ground should mean creating and defending opportunities for meaningful exchange across wide chasms of cultural, intellectual, and political difference. When we understand common ground in this way, we see that it emerges from an important conviction, namely, that the vitality of democratic life depends upon public spaces where voices from different traditions and persuasions can encounter one another openly, honestly, and fairly. At the Hauenstein Center, we believe that colleges and universities, especially public liberal arts institutions like Grand Valley, have a crucial role to play in providing access to substantive intellectual resources that incorporate the differences of priority, sensibility, and circumstance existing in our society at large. In that way, we're hopeful that gatherings of this nature help people to do what our institutions of higher learning want them to do in the first place: learn broadly, think critically, listen sympathetically, debate strenuously, and approach matters of public concern with just a kernel of doubt that prepares us to cope with persistent ambiguity and rapid change, while fostering a productive and even edifying curiosity about those who don't share all of our beliefs. As Gleaves Whitney says, academic rigor requires intellectual diversity, just as ethical and effective leadership demands real engagement with strong interlocutors of different views. If none of us wish to live by the grip of a stultifying conformity, then we are compelled not to demonize our opponents, but instead to build and populate a forum in which nuanced, but nevertheless impactful encounters can take place. After all, what's the alternative? In the year 2017, I think we know what that sounds like. It's something we've already witnessed. It's a public language that too often becomes coarse and rigid on all sides and conditioned more by a fractured media landscape than by serious confrontation of enduring questions about society and the human condition. So at the Hauenstein Center, we believe that scholarship and the humanities have a serious role to play in helping students and citizens alike to enter the public square with a sense of depth, with an appreciation of complexity and variety, and with an understanding of our shared responsibility to the past, to the future, and to one another, all of which good citizenship requires. And on that note, I am proud to introduce our first keynote presenter of this year's summit, a thinker who is deeply committed to the civic mission of historical scholarship. Professor Bill McClay is the G.T. and Libby Blankenship Chair in the History of Liberty at the University of Oklahoma. He's held appointments as a senior scholar at the Woodrow Wilson International Center in Washington, D.C., and as a senior fellow of the Ethics and Public Policy Center and the Trinity Forum. Professor McClay served 11 years on the advisory board of the National Endowment for the Humanities. He is a member of the United States Semi-Quincentennial Commission, whose task it is to plan, develop, and coordinate the commemoration of the history of the United States leading up to its 250th anniversary. He's also a recipient of the Merle Curti Award from the Organization of American Historians, which he won for his book, The Masterless: Self and Society in Modern America, published by the University of North Carolina Press. Professor McClay's presentation today is titled Meritocracy, Expertise, and the Future of Democracy. So without further ado, please help me give a warm welcome to Bill.
Good morning. It is bright and early, isn't it? Thank you all for coming out. I'm delighted to be here to see old friends and hopefully make some new ones. So, and and to contribute to what I think is such an eminently worthwhile enterprise for reasons that have just been stated. As the first speaker of the day, I want to get started on the right foot, maybe I should say the correct foot, in a useful way, by exploring some areas of possible common ground, ways in which conservatives and progressives and others might learn from one another and perhaps even contemplate ways of making common cause, which is a little different from common ground. To be, in a sense, this common ground begins with the problem of structural inequality in our society, growing structural inequality. This is a traditional concern of the left in all times and all places. It's also become a concern of conservatives in recent years. We clearly have some dangerous inequalities and social chasms in our society, a loss of common culture, and certainly a loss of opportunity, economic and otherwise, for huge portions of our society. It's, I think, important to acknowledge at the outset that the left has long been more attuned to these issues and spoken with insight about them for a long time. The problem of deindustrialization, of plant closings and the displacements caused thereby, outsourcing of jobs overseas, adverse effects of multilateral trade agreements on American labor. All these and many other changes that fall under the terms, big terms, neoliberalism or globalization, terms that, for all of their analytic power, don't always capture the exact nature of the revolutionary changes that we're going through. In any event, I want to talk today about one aspect of this revolution. I want to concentrate on the effects, some of them highly ironic, of our ever-deepening commitment to the ideal of meritocracy, or to put it more directly, to the idea that no one's prospects in life should be determined a priori by the conditions of his or her birth, and that men and women's advance in their society and career should be strictly a product of their merits and not of any other external advantages. These are quintessentially American ideas. And the concept of merit has been central to a Republican nation that from its inception sought to banish titles of nobility and other hereditary distinctions of rank, as well as practices such as primogeniture and entail that had long been characteristic of European aristocratic societies. But even the most equality-affirming republic needs to find a way to select the most talented and effective leaders out of the general pool of its citizenry. How can that be done? In Republican America, and I'm using small r Republican, the answer was to be sought in what Thomas Jefferson and John Adams called a natural aristocracy, which in effect meant an aristocracy of merit rather than heredity. Those with demonstrable talents and experience, those seen to possess the skills, knowledge, and character requisite for the best, the aristoi, would therefore be the most deserving of high standing and high responsibility. Rule by merit in its purest form is no respecter of persons. It does not dispense free passes to the well-born and the well-connected. It provides equal opportunity for natural ability to show forth, and sees to it that individual merit emerges from even the most unpromising conditions of birth. I'm talking here, of course, of the ideal type. It seeks to be a form of aristocracy, of rule by the best, but it accomplishes this by carefully observing the democratic canon that such advancement must be open to all. In fact, because of its openness to new talent, wherever it appears, a meritocracy could claim to be more fully the rule of the best than any hereditary aristocracy. As we know from history, hereditary aristocracies tend to not necessarily breed the best over time, to put it mildly. But as historian Joseph Kett of the University of Virginia has written, there are at least two strikingly different ways in which merit has been understood in our history, in American history. The founding generation itself and the early republic thought in terms of what Kett calls essential merit, by which he meant merit that rests on specific, visible, individual achievements that were thought in turn to reflect the individual's estimable character, quite apart from his or her social rank. Merit was that quality in the person that propelled his achievements, his essential character, hence essential merit. Those who did the achieving were known in the time as men of merit, a term one frequently encountered in the period's writings and speech, as in this 1778 4th of July oration by South Carolina politician David Ramsey, obviously an ancestor of Dave Ramsey. And this is a pure ode to the new nation as a land of opportunity. I just briefly quote, "All offices lie open to men of merit, of whatever rank or condition. Even the reins of state may be held by the son of the poorest men, if possessed of abilities equal to the important station." Close quote. But over time, a different way of understanding merit began to emerge. An ideal that Kett, the historian from Virginia that I'm borrowing all this from, Kett called institutional merit. This new form of merit, rather than concerning itself with questions of character, concerned the acquisition of specialized knowledge, the kind of knowledge that's susceptible of being taught in schools, tested in written examinations, and certified by expert staffed credentialing bodies. This new approach to the demonstration of merit manifested itself, Kett argues, in the proliferation of, I quote, precedent-laden legal briefs, peer-reviewed scientific articles, command of the principles of military organization learned in war colleges, and diplomas from reputable educational institutions, close quote. The testability and measurability of this form of merit is of key importance. We see this usage of the term merit in the very title of our National Merit Scholarships, one of the most prestigious awards open to high school students, but an award that's based entirely on a student's getting a high score on a standardized multiple choice aptitude test, rather than anything that he or she has actually done. This example reflects the fact that institutional merit, as opposed to essential merit, means the assessment of promise rather than deeds, the production of credentials rather than accomplishments, the measurement of aptitudes rather than the achievements themselves. It has been the guiding spirit behind the proliferation of educational testing, intelligence testing, and other forms of standardized and quantitative evaluation that are meant to sort out objectively the distinct, inherent, and potential capacities of otherwise unranked and undifferentiated individuals. And thus, we have the form of what for us has come to be called meritocracy. The term itself, meritocracy, is relatively new. It dates back to the sociologist Michael Young's 1958 dystopian satire, The Rise of the Meritocracy. But the practice it designates is very old, particularly in China, where it can be found enunciated as a principle by Confucius in the 6th century BCE and extended in practice back to the Han Dynasty through the use of written examinations to evaluate and rank officials in the imperial civil service bureaucracy. And as this example implies, the use of testing and other objective criteria of institutional merit is frequently conjoined to and an outgrowth of the institutional needs of authoritative bureaucratic organizations. Emphasis both on authoritative and bureaucratic. As Michael Young perceived, Michael Young, the author of The Rise of Meritocracy, it's also particularly well suited, this approach to meritocracy, to the needs of modern society, in which the old ways of assigning place by ascription or inheritance or patronage would no longer do, and instead the Weberian principle of rationalization prevails over all else. In Young's book, which he calls a fable, it is fictional. I remind you as I give this description, you may need to remind yourself this is fictional. A series of educational reforms in the late 20th century established the principle of merit as the principal means of social sorting and the ultimate criterion for advancement into the courts of political authority. Merit, above all, in Young's fable, meant the possession of an IQ of at least 125, preferably much higher. What Plato had dreamed of, philosophers becoming kings and kings becoming philosophers, the meritocratic scheme of things, as Young envisioned it, was seeking to make a reality of sorts by engineering the means by which political and cultural power could be turned over to a cognitive elite. But as Young realized would be the case, and as we are now perhaps seeing happen in our own times to our puzzlement and dismay, the meritocratic idea has proven highly problematic, not to mention controversial and even destructive, particularly in a society that has not entirely abandoned its democratic ideals and aspirations. In Young's fable, the losers in the meritocratic race, poor souls for whom any excuse for their failures had been taken away in advance by the impersonal and procedural objectivity of the tests by which they're excluded, these poor souls were nonetheless consumed, not surprisingly, with resentment and shame, and they eventually engineer in the book a successful revolt in the year 2034. So we still have 17 years to go. They were referred to by Young as the populists. About that, the populists. And the populists in Young's book were an odd alliance. This is not quite corresponding to the current scene. A part of it does. An odd alliance of lower class men who had been relegated to menial work and higher class women who had become imprisoned by the imperative of raising high IQ children. Two highly dissident groups that had in common a desire to free society from its dependence on a mathematical measure of all things, a mathematical measure that had the effect of imprisoning them. I tried to come up with a catchy phrase, Betty Friedan's comfortable concentration camp and hillbilly elegy kind of brought together, but I haven't quite got it. And in the end, this combination brought the meritocracy down in Young's fable. In his telling, the meritocracy generated its own downfall by generating the discontents that made its downfall inevitable. It is, of course, hard to say whether something like that could be beginning in our own time. The political turbulence of the 2016 presidential election in both political parties in the United States, as well as the rising antagonisms directed toward the uber-meritocratic post-national elites that run the institutions of the European Union. All these things suggest that it may very well be something in our future, something like it. But clearly this much is the case. We've arrived at a point where the problematic character of our meritocracy and the possibility that is in the long run incompatible with any meaningful sense of democracy have become impossible to ignore. The nub of the problem was anticipated and summed up with great concision by the sociologist Daniel Bell in a 1972 essay on meritocracy and equality. And I quote from a sentence, 2 sentences in that. There can never be a pure meritocracy because high-status parents will invariably seek to pass on their positions either through the use of influence or simply by the cultural advantages that their children inevitably possess. Thus, after one generation, a meritocracy simply becomes an enclaved class. Bell also offered the observation that if a modern post-industrial meritocracy is at bottom a system of selection by intelligence, and if, as he contended in 1972, intelligence is largely based on hereditary and genetic differences, then a meritocratic system will be one in which awards privilege, his word, based on an arbitrary genetic lottery, which is, he says, the antithesis of social justice. And he might well have added that assortative mating practices, which tend to bring together members of the cognitive elite in marriage and family formation, will, in the fullness of time, only amplify the divide between their offspring and the rest of the population. In addition, the families in which such children are raised will likely impart to them the habits of reading, study, learning, and discussion, as well as a fairly uniform set of social skills and approved attitudes, tastes, and political views, thus bestowing on them a cluster of genetic and environmental advantages that those without such advantages will find hard even to comprehend, let alone duplicate. The highly educated marry the highly educated, the technically skilled do the same, pouring their resources into the education and formation of their own children. And thus does the meritocratic elite glide into becoming an enclaved elite, one that can claim with a straight face that it is still a genuinely meritocratic elite, even if the system of meritocratic selection is absurdly skewed in their favor and that of their offspring. And so it will seem to them, who after all have generally worked very hard to gain entrance to Harvard and Yale, and have generally not had their status handed to them on a silver platter. But it will not seem so to those for whom even the formation and formulation of such impossibly remote goals would be inconceivable and futile, sadly. This growing tendency in our own times toward harder and higher barriers separating the new cognitive elite from the rest of humanity is a variation on the same theme that Young sounded nearly 60 years ago, and it's reflected in a great deal of the most incisive and penetrating social commentary we have in recent times. Charles Murray's Coming Apart, Robert Putnam's Our Kids, Bill Bishop's The Big Sort, which was mentioned last night, Angela Codevilla's The Ruling Class, Joel Kotkin's The New Class Conflict, and J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy. All of these very recent books concern themselves with the way in which the clustering of the like-minded, and particularly the self-segregation and insulation of the best-off and most flourishing elite classes from the diminishing prospects of much of the rest of middle-class and working-class American society has been a development that has gravely weakened our common life and exploded now into our politics. To blame the concept and practice of meritocracy for all this is obviously a vast oversimplification. But meritocracy plays a critical role in performing the measurements, assessments, aptitude testing, grading, and other metrics that have gone into our unprecedented way of sorting out our population. We have to face the uncomfortable fact that meritocracy, while democratic in its intentions, may have turned out to be colossally undemocratic in its results. And when one considers the steep decline of opportunity for those Americans who must live outside the magic circle of meritocratic validation, those middle and working class Americans who must deal with the steady erosion of unskilled and semi-skilled jobs for those lacking advanced education, the downward pressure on wages and unemployment caused by the steady export of jobs and steady import of immigrants competing for the diminishing number of low-skilled jobs that remain, and the open condescension with which such people's anxieties and fears are regarded by much of the meritocratic elite class. With all of this, it's not surprising that the growing edge of bitterness and anger, even rage, has crept into what passes for our national discourse. As Charles Murray himself has observed, quote, "During the past half-century of economic growth, virtually none of the rewards have gone to the working class." The left, by the way, has been saying this for a long time. Real family income of people in the bottom half of the distribution, income distribution, hasn't increased since the late 1960s. That state of affairs cannot stand for much longer without eventually provoking a strong reaction of the very sort that we saw in both political parties. Dan McCarthy's candidate was also for election, but especially in the Republican Party in the 2016 presidential campaign. Making it all worse is the fact that the meritocratic elite that has gotten these rewards is ceasing to be truly meritocratic, as Daniel Bell predicted. This new elite is now, devolving into a class apart, very much separated from the notion of essential merit. And yet those who dwell inside the magic circle can continue to entertain the view that it was not their advantages, but their own meritorious efforts that placed them there. They are not entirely wrong to think so, of course, but they may be more wrong than they know. And many of them do realize it in ways that gnaw at them. Let me insert a personal anecdote here. I spent the first part of this week, Monday and Tuesday, at Middlebury College, a place that a lot of people know about that didn't know about it 6 months ago because of the events there. I gave a public lecture on Monday night, took my football helmet, but I didn't need it at all. It was very nice. And I spent a lot of time talking to faculty and students about the eruption that occurred on their campus earlier this spring related to the appearance of none other than Charles Murray as an invited speaker on campus. And lots of discussion of free speech and its limits, a very important discussion. But I was surprised there was no mention by anyone of the ways in which the themes of Murray's recent work, which I just quoted, are vividly reflected in the impoverished communities of Vermont that surround the toniness of Middlebury, the town and the campus. These are areas with high rates of opioid abuse by the young. They have dismal economic prospects. One Middlebury student told me very movingly that he saw a powerful streak of what he called self-hatred operating in his fellow students, a vein of guilt for the advantages they knew that they possessed and for finding themselves such immensely privileged students dwelling in this paradise of storybook beauty. But, of course, they looked at everything except what was right under their nose to arrive at that conclusion. So, what is to be done? First, we need to consider whether the meritocracy we now have is turned into a betrayal of the open spirit of advancement by merit that Thomas Jefferson and David Ramsay, forebear of Dave Ramsay, were referring to at the time of the nation's founding. Can we recover an understanding of meritocracy that's something much looser, something less systematic, less centrally administered, something less obsessed with the invention and earning of credentials, and with intensive standardized testing directed at measuring aptitudes, something that instead seeks to preserve the simpler aspiration that, as Ramsey said, all offices lie open to those men and women of essential merit who are willing to seek them, and that we throw in their way as few artificial barriers as possible. Furthermore, perhaps we should consider whether the colossus of American higher education, as presently existent, is really such an effective and efficient sorting mechanism for our society. Now, here I'm biting the hand that feeds me, but do the results really justify the extravagant, even crippling expense of college and professional education at a time of extremely scarce entry-level employment for recent graduates? A time, moreover, when the aggregate student loan debt in the United States has reached well over $1 trillion, with, as of 2014, the most recent year I could find figures, more than 7 million debtors in default. Our meritocratic ideal was not always so dysfunctional. There was a time well within the memory of some people in this audience when one's advancement in life was not so heavily determined by the credential of where or even whether one went to college. Among the greatest of America's 20th century presidents, and one of the most literate and historically minded of them since the time of the founders, was Harry Truman. Harry Truman did not have a college education at all. He graduated from high school and began his adult life working for the Santa Fe Railroad. By way of contrast, one of the most curious episodes in the early part of the 2016 presidential campaign was the intense controversy over whether Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker should be considered unqualified for the presidency, notwithstanding his extensive experience in public life, because he'd never finished college. Sacre bleu. A mere 70 years ago, the question would never have arisen. It's a question that would only be alive in a credentials-mad society. Now, the less organized, more decentralized America of Truman's day had many faults, and I don't want to romanticize them out of the picture. But the worst of its faults was the failure to extend equally to all Americans the opportunities that a Truman enjoyed. This is a fault that only serves to confirm the worthiness of the ideal. For all of its imperfections, a more loose-jointed, less credentialed, crazed America would be more open to sheer human possibility than the putatively meritocratic iron cage of standardized tests and glib interpersonal skills that we're so proud now of having constructed and imagined to be fairer and less elitist than what it replaced. We need to find ways to restore a less regimented, less class and status stratified, less school-sorted, more open-ended America, one more respectful of men and women of all stations and educational levels. We need an economy and legal structures that are open to enterprise and innovation, an educational system that's open to all and not geared to the manufacture of credentials or artificial rites of passage, but to the empowering of individuals, a society that concerns itself with knowledge and skills that a person can acquire, not where or how he or she acquired them. Why, for example, could we not restore the practice of bringing talented and ambitious young people into professions such as law through apprenticeships, as was done in the time of the founders, instead of insisting that they expend hundreds of thousands of dollars on a law school credential that means less and less with each passing year and only serves to delay their entrance into the workforce? Why could we not do the same thing with engineers, accountants, teachers, healthcare professionals, and the like? Would not such changes move us back in the direction of a restoration of essential merit? And I was going to stop here, but I want to add a coda that was stimulated by the mention last night of Richard Hofstadter's book and argument, Anti-Intellectualism in American Life. someone asked if Hofstadter's argument was accurate. And I thought Dan McCarthy gave a great answer that, if I may paraphrase it, if we've lost faith in the technocratic authority of intellectuals, it's because the intellectuals have failed so miserably in foreign policy, in social policy, in economic policy, and I would add, in imposing a divisive regime of identity politics that's tearing the nation apart and making common ground impossible as an offense against the God of diversity. But it's important to distinguish here between the dignity and authority of the intellect per se and the authority of intellectuals operating as an organized and self-conscious social group. The first is the baby. The second is the bathwater. That is, the intellect is a baby. The authority of intellectuals organized as a social group is the bathwater. Just as our dysfunctional system of meritocracy ought not to cause us to abandon the idea of merit altogether, so our questioning of the judgments of organized intellectuals, whether they call themselves scientists, engineers, economists, or whatever else, ought not to be equated with an attack on the dignity and utility of the human intellect. In both cases, the operation of democratic public opinion is a legitimate counterforce. It's an essential counterpoint to the pronouncements of specialized communities of experts, which even in the best of circumstances reflect limited interests and parochial perspectives. The dream of technocracy, meaning the rule of society by organized and accredited experts who in turn direct an enveloping web of bureaucrats, engineers, civil servants, doctors, and other professional and technical specialists, employing a vast and all-embracing state apparatus, this is deeply antithetical to the messiness of democracy. Let me, in conclusion, give 2 examples in support of this. The first concerns science. Early in his administration, in fact, in his inaugural address, President Obama promised to, I quote, restore science to its rightful place. And then a few days later, in signing some legislation, he decried the fact that in the Bush years, quote, our government has forced what I believe is a false choice between sound science and moral values, when, as anyone can plainly see, the two are not inconsistent. Unfortunately, while balanced and pleasing, this statement collapses at a second's reflection. It's not hard, after all, to think of ways that science can be both entirely sound and completely oblivious to moral values. This was precisely the point of physicist Robert Oppenheimer's famous confession that the pursuit of the atomic bomb, the development of the atomic bomb, was a task, his famous words, too technically sweet for scientists to resist it. You go ahead and do it, Oppenheimer said, and you argue about what to do about it only after you have had your technical success. Given the universality of human motivations, it's foolish to imagine that this was a one-off and there will not be many more scientists on many more occasions in laboratories across the land in which the false choice that President Obama decried is an all too real one. We don't have to conjure up images of James Bond scientists operating out of caves in the middle of the ocean to imagine this. Second example, and then I'll stop, is a situation in which the putative experts turned out not to be experts at all, the entire profession of economics. No social, now if you hear a little resentment in my voice here, I really can't help myself. No social scientific field has been more confident of its scientific accuracy, its mathematical perfection. None has been filled with a greater sense of self-importance. Then came the global financial crisis of a decade ago, and a great, although transient, humbling ensued. I love this. Queen Elizabeth, my hero. Why, she said, why did no one see this crisis coming? Good question. And in response to her question, A panel of experts assembled by the British Academy offered the following answer to her question. I'm not making this up. Quote, everyone seemed to be doing their job properly, and according to standard measures of success, they were often doing it well. The failure was to see how collectively this added up to a series of interconnected imbalances over which no single authority had jurisdiction. It was principally the failure of the collective imagination of many bright people. That's the conclusion. And one might say this is a failure of expertise itself, or at least of our methods of certifying and deploying it. To understand in greater depth how such a failure could occur, it's useful to look at some offhand remarks by the economist Robert Shiller, an honest man, who, at least so far as I know, who had advised the Federal Reserve Bank of New York all the way up to, but just short of the crash. But he kept quiet about this dangerous housing bubble he thought he saw developing. I quote, while I warned about the bubbles, I did so very gently, and I felt vulnerable in expressing such quirky views. Deviating too far from consensus leaves one feeling potentially ostracized from the group, with the risk that one may be terminated. In other words, the communities of the competent, as we often refer to expert communities, often behave like communities of the conforming. And what Shiller describes as a situation that was rendered intellectually and morally dangerous, not by the fact of expert consensus, but by the illegitimate way in which the consensus was sustained, by shutting people up, either directly or indirectly. The fear that dissenting views could not be safely aired. We see this scenario, and this is getting to some of the purpose of this conference. We see this scenario enacted again and again with regard to important issues of great public moment, in which powerful voices and lazy journalists declare that all the experts are in agreement and the debate is over. Nothing is more corrosive of the spirit of science and truth-seeking than this bullying dogmatism. Surely the example of the financial crisis and the Economist offers us many lessons in this regard. But above all, it suggests the crucial importance of keeping diversity of opinion and perspective alive in our communities, disciplinary communities, our fora, in our public culture. It suggests how imperative it is for the health of the whole that alternative opinion not be peremptorily shut out, and that the dominant paradigms and meritocratic machinery of the normal science of the day not tyrannize over our discourse. Experts should have a voice in our democracy, a resounding and respected one, but only that. They cannot speak ex cathedra or expect to be automatically funded, let alone obeyed, merely for the letters after their name or the sheepskins on their wall or the professional associations to which they belong. They also have to persuade, to speak a public language, to bring themselves up to the level of the democratic bar and make their case patiently and respectfully in a way that passes muster with their fellow citizens. An impenetrably technocratic, top-down solution to social or economic problems that does not meet that standard, does not seek the informed consent of the governed, is unacceptable because it's a betrayal of the very idea of a democratic republic, however democratic its avowed intentions may be. Thank you.
Thank you for the talk. I enjoyed it. It's good to see you again, Bill. Andrew Hartman.
Good to see you, yes.
So in your criticism of meritocracy, most of which I really liked and agreed with, it seemed like there was no mention of capitalism, or that is the type of social thought or social attitudes that American capitalism has long engendered, and that is that merit is confirmed by wealth. And to me, the most dangerous manifestation of that, particularly recently, has been the attitude that taxation of wealth is unjust because wealth is deserved, or you merit your wealth. And our tax policies, especially since 1980, have exacerbated the economic inequality that you lament. And that sort of breeds a worse form of the meritocracy, the sort of like hardened, crystallized, non-meritocratic meritocracy that you described. So how do you sort of make sense of that?
Yeah, well, I mean, one can't solve all the problems at once in one fell swoop. And actually, Andrew, I thought you might be going towards with capitalism. Weber's equating capitalism with the highest form of rationalization. That is, subjecting every social institution, every action, every social role to the sort of utility standard, to the cost effectiveness, to and this is something that I think conservatives find very disagreeable about capitalism, as a way in which it at least some conservatives, my kind of conservatives, find it disagreeable that it subjects all tradition, all ascription, everything that is inherited to this same relentless cost-benefit calculation. But yes, I think that these problems of concentrated wealth are very hard to deal with, and the question I would have is whether meritocracy, as we understand it now, is any better at dealing with those problems, those inequities. We've had an ever-growing meritocratic order that dictates much of employment and the deployment of resources in our society, and yet we have an ever-widening, yawning gulf. Now, that you might say, well, changes in tax policy might affect that as well. They might. Yeah, I guess that's really all I can have to say about that. I didn't talk about capitalism because I had a different subject. Yeah.
Thank you, Bill. David Urban, Calvin College. Excuse me. I've been trying to think about the various subjects, topics you were discussing, and I'm wondering what are realistic solutions to the problems you raise, apart from what would be something that I think would exacerbate the problem, which would be somehow more government involvement to somehow solve the problem, which I think...
I need to get you and Andrew Hartman talking to one another.
Well, actually, I'm concerned about what Andrew said, because I think that I'm not exactly sure what his solution is, but if the idea is to somehow tax
well, he wanted to know what my solution, in fairness,
right. Well, if it's to tax, yeah, fair, I agree. But I mean, to tax the corporations more just makes things more problematic for the people who might work for these companies, what have you. But I see there to be two, at least, movements that would have, I think, helpful solutions to the issues you're raising regarding this meritocracy that just becomes another oligarchy, okay? And one is, they're simple things. The proliferation of knowledge through the internet, as well as options for school choice. And again, if government chooses to regulate the internet more, that would, I think, just codify the kinds of so-called meritocratic elites that you're concerned about. And then with school choice, again, if government mitigates against school choice, as it has done in the past, again, what does that do but keep those people who would like more opportunities, who don't have the inherited money, who don't have the kind of parents who could give them the opportunities that you're talking about. Okay, those people who don't have those opportunities, are they not benefited by school choice as well as the distribution of ideas through the internet? And if those are, if government gets out of the way and allows such knowledge to proliferate through school choice and through the internet, cannot that give more opportunities, even in the face of this meritocracy that you describe as so problematic?
Yeah, I mean, look, I agree with you that democratization of access to resources, in this case, information, is a great thing and something that should be encouraged, and that actually the public sector, I think, needs to play a role in that. It's not to ensure that that kind of access is not controlled by private entities, but that it's open to the larger public. And school choice gets to the question of institution building, because one of the problems with having access to information, that's one thing, but there are reasons why we need and value schools as institutional venues where people learn together, and that where they learn under some kind of authority, a teacher, an embodied authority rather than the authority of the computer screen. What I guess one of the things that I favor, and it's compatible with an older, less corporate understanding of capitalism, a more entrepreneurial understanding, is an order that appeals to and unleashes and otherwise encourages the enterprise of individuals. This is one of the things that is very exciting about the charter school, which is, there you're talking about a kind of public school, but charter schools, private schools of various kinds, homeschooling. You and I know some people who are involved in that. These are all ways in which parents are encouraged to take responsibility for their children rather than turn them over to educational authorities who may or may not be able to carry that authoritative stance off in an effective way. There are some great public schools in the country, but there's some miserable and hopeless ones, probably many more, and many mediocre ones. Yes, and I mean, even things as simple as to move away from education, although this applies in education. Do we really need to have the licensure of cosmetologists to allow a woman to hang out a shingle and go into business as a beautician? Do we need to impose this kind of pseudo-rigorous licensure for a perfectly normal activity that people ought to be encouraged to undertake as sidelines to their other employment, or as a source of forming a business that may eventually create jobs for other people and certainly creates economic activity in their venue, in their area. Multiply these 100-fold, and you begin to have my very precise term, a more loose-jointed economy, a more loose-jointed way of life. You know, the example I always think of in this, and it's a somewhat loaded example because it involves Abraham Lincoln, and nobody can object to Abraham Lincoln. It's like the opposite of the Hitler argument. You invoke Hitler, argumentum ad Hitlerum, but the argumentum ad Lincoln is sort of the opposite end. It all has to be golden. But consider that Lincoln, probably the greatest orator in our history, just to mention nothing else about him, had almost no formal schooling. He read the King James Bible and Shakespeare's plays very closely, particularly Macbeth and a few others. That was his education. He became an attorney through the sort of apprenticeship means that I've described as a pretty good way to go about it. He was a damn good attorney, and made a fair amount of money in that. But what we know and revere him for is not only his actions, his presence, but his words. And this is a man who developed a mastery of the English language, an American version of the English language, through almost no schooling, almost no formation in an institutional, meritorious way. He's the least likely candidate for institutional merit. and yet probably the greatest speaker in the history of our country, maybe in the English world. Churchill certainly thought so, and his judgment's not bad in that department. So, and of course, you all know the story of the Gettysburg Address that Lincoln gave, maybe arguably the most memorable of all of his speeches in Gettysburg. And with him on the day as the other speaker was Edward Everett, former governor of Massachusetts, former president of Harvard, et cetera, a man who had, all the credentials of an Air Force general today. And among other things, was the first American to get a PhD from a German university. And he gave a speech that no one remembers, a very learned, florid, acrobatic speech that's actually pretty interesting and worth reading, but it's not Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, and it has not survived, and it really doesn't deserve to survive in the sense of being read by school children and incorporated, read, marked, learned, and inwardly digested, the way the Gettysburg Address does, as a kind of iconic thing. And I mean, all of this is to point to, where did Lincoln come from? He didn't come from, he was not formed on the playing fields of Eton. He was formed in a very American way, a frontier existence in which, in various ways, a tremendous ambition that his law partner Herndon spoke of was formed in him. And the opportunity in a very loose-jointed society to go where his ambitions took him. We don't live in that world. Frederick Jackson Turner said we don't have that frontier anymore, but we could do better to try to replicate some aspects of it, including the reduction of barriers of entry to areas of life that meritocratic gatekeepers keep watch over. So I hope that's an answer to your question.
Do we have time for one more? One more question. So I engage regularly with young adults in conversation, and one of the things that I've been challenged by them is to find reference in popular culture to the concept or the idea of wisdom or being wise. It was pointed out by one of my young staffers that we don't describe any politicians, any celebrities, or even for that matter, any intellectuals anymore as wise people. And that in of itself just sort of stops me every time I think about it. But this also ties in with a shift in liberal education. When I present to college students, one of the things I'm struck by regularly is that they're engaged in a liberal education because they want a good job. I very rarely meet a young adult who is looking for an education to be a more sophisticated person or a better, civic leader, or to just better their own character. And so it seems that there's been a pretty profound shift in the cultural interpretation of these two words and activities. And I was wondering if that plays in at all with what you're talking about in meritocracy and this shift, and maybe if some of the seeds of the situation have been sown in this area, and maybe we can try and do something about it.
That's an interesting question, and there's a couple of things that come to mind. One is that I think it's been very, I hate the way this is going to sound, but I think that in many ways higher education has become damaged by being inflated into being something that every person, not even just middle-class people, but everybody needs to have, not only can or should aspire to, but must have. And this is partly because of the sort of stupidly meritocratic notions that we have that you must have a college degree in order to be a really conscientious hamburger flipper or whatever job it is. I mean, it's astonishing how many jobs require a college degree. So that credentialing, this is part of what I call the credential-crazed society, is one element in that. It has something to do with the intellectual temper of the times, that we're impressed by people who are sort of smart and canny and unillusioned and who sort of see through all the BS and are woke, and and wisdom is a much more genial in a way. It can be very hard-edged, but it's a much more embracing kind of thing. And maybe it's hard to be wise about a world that's so much in flux. But one thing I do want to say about this is that I don't find, in my experience, that the kind of people who are looking for what you describe and the kind of people who are not, I don't find it correlates nearly as much as one might think it would, with social class. I think someone like J.D. Vance, who I met a while ago, and who came from this appalling background that, if any of you have read Hillbilly Elegy, you know about. This is a person who was driven by intense and disinterested, in the best sense of the word, curiosity, and is still, I think, searching. So he doesn't see education strictly in terms of its utility. I would add one other thing. I'm a product of a great books college, so sue me. I'm obviously prejudiced in favor of that kind of thing. I think it's enriched my life in ways I could barely begin to calculate. And a few years ago, I was in Italy. I was a Fulbright professor in Rome, and a friend who runs a think tank that deals with sort of trying to promote the great books ideal in American colleges said, "Hey, would you go around and talk to some of the Italian and Swiss universities, presidents and provosts and leaders, deans, whatever, about the possibility of our organizing seminars on the great books in their schools?" And so I did, and I found invariably the response was one of sort of open-mouth incredulity, that they didn't understand what the point of such a thing would be, because their understanding of the purpose of post-secondary education is to prepare yourself for the civil service. That's it. And really, more specifically, to take the examinations attendant upon entering into the civil service. There's meritocracy for you, at its best and at its worst. But the notion that in a disinterested way, that is a non-utilitarian way, or in a commonplace sense, a useless way, a way that is not directed towards use, to study Plato, Aristotle, read Dante, Shakespeare, etc., and reflect on them and incorporate them into your thinking. This was just not something that entered into their minds as a prospective part of their agenda as institutions. American colleges and universities are fairly unique in this regard. I don't think we appreciate how unique they are. I don't think we appreciate how fortunate we are, even now, to have the diversity of kinds of institutions that we have. Single-sex colleges, historically black colleges and universities, religious colleges, and on and on. We have many different kinds of institutions, and may that continue to be the case. That's part of the diversity that we need to preserve in order to have a diversity of viewpoints in the public sphere, and keep ourselves open to the things that we may be missing, which we almost certainly are. This is why conservatives need progressives, and progressives need conservatives to tell them what they're missing. Thank you.